Hello, and welcome to this demonstration of the Apollo product. For those of you who are new to Apollo, Apollo is a brand new technology. It's called an analytics management system. And the goal of Apollo is to help you improve and streamline and make more efficient your Adobe or Google Analytics implementation. Apollo has a bunch of features that automate some of the things that are normally done manually. It also takes advantage of APIs to save you tons of time when it comes to managing your digital analytics implementation. In this demonstration, I'll walk you through all of the core features of Apollo and show you some of the cool things that it can do. So when you log into Apollo, you'll notice right away a couple things in the navigation. First of all, there's an area for agencies. Multiple consulting firms, including Search Discovery, can use Apollo, and this will indicate which agency you're part of, either Search Discovery or another third-party agency. Within agencies, there's also organizations. So you can have lots of different organizations if, say, you have multiple businesses as part of your organization. And then you have a concept of a property. And a property is usually aligned to a tag management instance, say like Adobe Launch. If you have multiple websites, it doesn't mean you have to have multiple properties. In Apollo, you could, but you don't have to. You could actually use one Apollo property to manage multiple websites or mobile apps if you're using the same implementation and maybe have the same tag management setup. In the left navigation, you'll notice that there's four key areas. There's the design area where you figure out what it is that you really want to do with your implementation. The document area, which is where you're looking at all the documentation that's needed to actually do the implementation. The deploy area is where you start pushing things out to your analytics tool and your tag management system. And then the act area is where you can start doing things like building reports and taking advantage of the data. Now, when you first go into Apollo, there's two different ways that you could start designing. One is to map your existing analytics implementation into Apollo, which really will kind of jumpstart your implementation and give you variables and business requirements right out of the box of things that you're already doing. Or you can skip that step and you can just start right with business requirements. In this demo, I'm going to use a scenario where someone is an Adobe Analytics customer and they already have an Adobe Analytics implementation. You'll notice that some of these things are locked out, and I've got a warning message here saying, hey, you can't really do anything because you haven't finished mapping your implementation. We always want you to map your implementation first because that saves you the most time in the long run. So you can get to the map existing implementation a couple ways, but we have a handy link right here. So I'm just going to go to the map existing. Now you can see here that before I jumped into this demo, I started doing some mapping. I imported my existing Adobe Analytics implementation, which pulled in a bunch of EVARs, and down below you'll see some success events. And then I've enabled a couple of these saying, these are some variables that I want to continue to use in the future. And you may choose to use all of your variables or just some of them. In this case, I'm only using 4 out of the 21 variables I have in this fake implementation. Now, once you enable it, you can then assign it to the variables that exist in Apollo. And Apollo has a library of hundreds of variables and events that it already knows about, and all of those are tied to the business requirements. In this case, I was already doing EVAR1 and had page name in it. So I mapped that to page name in Apollo's world. And I said that the Apollo event that is going to set page name is page load started. If I scroll down here, you can see that another thing I'm doing is product name, which is NEVAR 6. I map that to product name, and I've associated that with order placed, product add to cart, and product view. Now, in some cases, the name in Apollo is going to be different than what you have. Here, I've got order ID in EVAR 19, but Apollo calls that purchase ID. So it doesn't really matter the name. It's just making sure you've got kind of apples to apples here, and that is mapped to the order placed. And then down below, I have an event that captures the price of the product when it's added to cart. That has a little bit of a different name in Apollo, but I found it here as product selling price at cart add, and that maps to product added to cart. And these are very simple to go through. So for example, if I wanted to add, say, full URL, I could simply turn that on and then search for, say, URL, and there's full URL. And then here, this list is dynamic. It will tell you any events that are possible with this, and you can choose the ones that make sense. In this case, there's only one, so I'll just choose that one. Now, when you're done mapping, you can either hit save and finish, or you can hit all mappings complete. I'm just gonna hit save and finish, and now that's all gonna be mapped. So now I'm all done, and now it says, okay, Apollo says you can now go to the business requirements area. So when I go to business requirements, now you'll see that I don't have the warning sign anymore, and I can turn on any requirements that I want. But one of the really cool things you'll notice is if I highlight the enabled requirements, by doing that mapping exercise, you'll see that I already have a bunch of business requirements that are enabled. In this case, there's 27 business requirements that are enabled. And the ones that are enabled make sense because they're similar to the things that we already mapped. So for example, how much selling price revenue was added to the shopping cart each day? Well, if we look underneath every requirement, there's a chevron here that shows you the actual solution design. And you can see that the reason this is turned on is because I already mapped that I want to do product selling price at cart add, and I'm already doing that in success event 6. So Apollo knows that I can answer that question. So once you've got enabled requirements, you can optionally choose to determine, are they important? Are they critical? Are they average? And you can even assign a person at the company who really cares about that requirement. And this can be used later for other purposes, for reporting and in the QA area. However, one of the coolest things of Apollo is that we have a library of hundreds of business requirements. If I choose to look at all business requirements, you could see that we have 1,037 business questions or business requirements. And you could find these in a lot of different ways. One thing you might want to do is filter by vertical. So since I'm using a B2C example, I might filter here and look at retail. This will filter those 1,000 requirements just for ones that we think make sense for retail clients. And if you look down here, you'll see that now we're looking at 387, which is still a lot, but it makes it a little more manageable. Another way that we could filter requirements is by site feature. These are the features that we've seen that are pretty common on most websites and mobile apps. And this is another way that you can think about finding and filtering requirements. So for example, if you have a login on your website, you might have things you want to know about users. So maybe here I see that there's a site feature called user authentication. If I click that, I can see that Apollo has now filtered down to 20 business requirements that are related to user authentication. And if I want to add one of these requirements, I don't even have to know much about Adobe Analytics or Google Analytics. I can simply toggle it on. And that has now been added to my implementation. And if I want, I could assign a priority and a stakeholder. If I'm curious, I can look underneath the chevron and actually see what is the solution design. How is this actually going to be implemented? But that's totally optional. Another way that you could find requirements is by doing a search. So maybe I want to look at things like exit pages. So I type in the word exit, and I can see a bunch of requirements that have the word exit in them. And if I want, I can toggle that on. And now I'll be able to answer this new business question. And it may be the case that there's other business questions that are also being enabled because I enabled this one if they use the same solution design. And then finally, we've added a cool feature called templates. And a template is a way that you can create a set of business requirements and save them as a grouping so that you could reuse them in the future. In this example, this organization has created something called the basic video tracking template. And if I select this, Apollo is going to filter just for the requirements that are in that template. As you can see, this is really basic. And if I want, I can either manually toggle these on, or there's a button that's available anytime you're doing any type of filtering that allows you to enable all filtered requirements. In this case, I'll click this button and it's going to warn me, are you sure you want to enable all of these requirements? And I'm going to say yes, and I will enable them. And now these two new requirements have been added. So if I go back and look at my enabled requirements, I can now see that I'm up to 45 business requirements that are part of my implementation. And obviously, you can keep going and add more and more as you need for your business. But I'm going to keep it short now and just do these requirements. Now, once you've had these requirements, the next step is to look at the assign custom variables. This is where you get to assign what variables in your analytics tool you are going to use for all of the events and attributes that Apollo decided you needed for your implementation. Now, right off the bat, you'll notice that you've got the name of the variable, a short description, and Apollo is telling you what type of variable you need. Since this is an Adobe Analytics implementation, it's either going to be an EVAR, a success event, or an SPROP. And it also is going to give you that attribute name that you chose earlier. And if it's a variable that you've mapped from your existing implementation, Apollo is smart enough to already know what variable you want to use, because obviously we want to keep using the same variable number and type, because that means you can leverage all of your historical data. But there's going to be some cases where we've added new requirements that need to have variable assignments. So in this case, we didn't have video name or video ID, so we can hit the drop down here and pick a variable number. In this case, we're only going to see options for EVARs because these two variables are designated as being EVARs by Apollo. Now, it doesn't matter what number you choose. And here, in this case, I'll just jump down here and put this in EVAR 40. You just want to choose variables that are open in your implementation. Now, when we get down to the success events, we're going to want to choose the right success event numbers or any numbers we want to put this in. I'll throw this in event 4. I'll throw this in event 5. Product views, I'm going to put in event 2. And then user sign-ins, I'll put in event 3. And when we're done and we see that everything has been mapped, we're going to hit save all. And this is going to lock all of these variable numbers in the Apollo database. Now, if you're not into doing business requirements, and you want to kind of think of it more from an event level on your website, maybe you're a little bit more on the technical side, another way that you can tell Apollo what you want in your design is to use this thing called event attributes. Now, event attributes are all of the actions that people take on your website. And if we filter here, we can see that we have a bunch of event attributes that are already enabled. We didn't have to do anything. Apollo did this in its relational database, but all of the events that we needed for the business questions that we selected are automatically turned on. And in some cases, they're already configured using variables. But we can add new ones if we want. So for example, let's say that I forgot to do cart viewed when I was doing business requirements. I can simply toggle on cart viewed, and then come to the configure area. And in the configuration, what you're going to see is that if there's any required variables, in this case, there's one success event that is required. You have to do it if you're doing Adobe Analytics. But what's really nice is you can see all of the variables that we've ever seen tied to this event called cart viewed. So in this case, I can see that a lot of times with cart views, people are tracking brand, name, and so on. And I can turn one of them on. So in this case, I'm going to turn on product name. I'm basically saying that when the cart view event fires, I want to also capture a product name. Now, in this case, it automatically knows what variable to use because we've already established that product name is one of our existing variables in the previous exercise. So it knows that EVAR 6 is the correct variable for it. But if I go to something that hasn't been done before, like product brand, and turn it on, I can even assign the variable right here. Apollo is telling me it has to be an EVAR. So I'll stick that in EVAR 5, and then I can hit save and close. And now I have two attributes that are associated with that cart viewed. Now that might actually turn on more business requirements for me, and it also will add new variables to that assign custom variable screen we saw earlier. But let's do something totally different. Let's do chat started. So if I decide to turn on chat started, here I can see that there's a required event, which is called chat started counter, but we don't know what success event to put it in. So I'm going to put that in event 20. And let's say that I want to have a unique ID for every chat session. So I'll put that in EVAR 20, just so all of my chat stuff is in the 20s. And I'll save and close. Now, by adding these two events, what's really cool is if I go to the assign custom variable screen, I should see new variables here. So if I scroll down, sure enough, I see chat session ID in EVAR 20, and I see chat started in event 20, and I probably would see a new EVAR 5, here it is, product brand. But what's even cooler is if I go to the business requirements and I look at my enabled requirements, you'll see that now we have a total of 51 requirements. I think before we were at like 45 or 47. And if you look at the top here, we have new questions related to chat. How many chat starts occur? What was the chart stated per visit ratio? What was the unique ID for every chat session? And if we expand the chevron, we can see why these were turned on because we have a new chat started event. We have a new attribute called chat session ID that has been mapped to EVAR 20. So whether you choose requirements or event attributes, it doesn't matter. You end up in the same place and you end up having a design that has all of the things that you need. Now let's talk about the documentation area. So it's really important to have constantly updated documentation when it comes to an analytics implementation. Normally, it takes weeks or months to build out a data layer specification and all the documentation needed for an analytics implementation. But as you can see here, in real time, Apollo has been dynamically building our data layer using a best practice event-driven data layer, and it's providing examples and everything that we need. This is 100% customized to all of the things that we've just added in this implementation. Now, for any of these elements here, we can see things like product added to cart. What is the code that I want to give developers to actually populate that? We can look here and we can see the code. And this will also get pushed down to a version control tool like GitHub, and I'll demonstrate that in a little bit. But underneath here, you'll see all of the attributes that are needed. And if we look at the details, we can even see some example values. If there's a regex pattern that needs to be followed from a QA purposes, that will be here as well. And all of this is just really powerful information that can be shared with your developers. Now, another thing that's a common thing you might want to do is add some notes to your data layer. So if you click add implementation notes, you can see that in this case, we've already started with some notes here, but you could edit this and you could add any other notes that you need to for this implementation. And these are notes that are just in general about the implementation. But another really cool feature that we've added is what if you want to add notes to a specific event? So in this case, maybe I want to add notes to product added to cart. Well, if I click the notes screen, what I can do is type in anything I want. I can add, say, a table. If I need to add a table to, communicate some things, row 1, row 2, and so on. And I can even communicate to my developers through maybe, say, messages or images. So for example, one of the things that I might want to do is show them a screenshot of the page that I'm talking about with product added to cart. So maybe I come in here and put an image, and maybe I say, here's the image that we're working on, and this is what we want to do. So I'm working on the Disney store, and here's the add to cart image. And all of this information will then be saved, and it will be pushed down to the version control tool, which in this case is GitHub. And if you ever want to see or preview those notes, again, you can come here and see all of those notes. So this is a really easy way just to kind of customize things and update what you need. Now, another feature of implementations is what we call data enrichment. Now, this is optional. You don't have to do this, but there are some cases in implementations where things aren't populated in the data layer. They're either done client side through, say, plugins, or server side through maybe things like DB Vista or processing rules. So just to kind of show you how data enrichment works, if I go back to the design area and I look at the event attributes, we have a couple attributes that have to do with enrichment. And here is client side and server side. So I'm going to turn on client side and server side, and I'm going to configure one of these. So I'm going to say that I want to put the analytics cookie ID in an EBAR, and I'll just stick this in EBAR 11 and then save. And then for server side, I'm going to track, say, the user agent string, and I'll put that in EBAR 12 and save. These are elements that don't really need to be in the data layer, but they still want to be part of your implementation. So if I go back to the business requirements and I look at my enabled, you'll see that if I search for, say, agent, that there's a new business requirement about user agent string. I can do that for analytics code as well. So if I search for, say, analytics, you can see that the analytics cookie ID has a new requirement. But in the documentation area, you're not going to see anything for user agent string or analytics cookie here, but you will see it in the data enrichment area. And this information does get pushed down to your version control tool like GitHub, just so that people know that this is going on and it's still part of your implementation. And it's important because you want to make sure that the variables are assigned as well. Now, if you go to the documentation area, you can see a list of all of the variables that you have in your implementation. If you want, you could even see some of the detailed settings, whether it's a regular EVAR, a merchandising EVAR. You can always download the latest solution design reference or SDR by clicking this button, and it'll save it as a spreadsheet for you. And there's also a testing report. I'll get to testing a little bit later, but there is a testing feature in the product that you could also download here. The visual SDR is a new concept which allows you to visually see how your Adobe or Google Analytics implementation is coming together. And you could see here that you got variables that roll up to events and attributes that then roll up into data layer and business requirements. So this is a way to easily see what's going on in your implementation. And it can also be helpful to see if you've made any mistakes along the way. Here, I purposely made a mistake. You'll notice that product brand is associated with the cart viewed event, but that doesn't really make sense. We probably want product brand with product added to cart, product viewed, maybe order placed. So there's a lot of places we want to know the product brand, but I made a mistake and I didn't select them. So I can go back to the design area. I can find the events that I may have messed up on, and I can update this. So really quickly, I'm going to just look at my enabled events, and I'm going to see which ones I want to update. So I definitely want product brand and order placed. So I'm going to go here, type in brand, and turn it on. Of course, Apollo already knows the variable to use, so that's all I have to do, and hit save. Now, I probably want to have it at product added to cart. So I'm going to do the same thing, search for brand and turn it on and save. And then there's one more. I did it for cart viewed, but I don't think I did it for product viewed. So I want to do it for product viewed. So I'll type in brand here, turn it on and save. Now this may turn on new business requirements as well, but what's really neat about this is that when I go back to the visual SDR in real time, if I find product brand, you will now see the product brand has 1, 2, 3, 4 branches coming from it. And now it's part of 4 different events. And I can even verify this by going to my data layer. Before I had product brand part of cart viewed, but now brand is in order placed. Brand is in product added to cart and product viewed. And if I look at my code, I can see brand has been added there. So that's how easy it is to update your documentation, see it visually, and so on. So now we've gotten to the point where we've designed everything that we want. We have all of our documentation updated, and now it's time to actually start implementing. We do this in the deploy area of Apollo, and we have a concept called builds. And a build is a collection of items that you've decided you want to implement at a point in time. So when we come to the builds area, I'm going to click to make a new build. Now I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call this my initial build. And I'm going to choose which tag manager I'm using, in this case, Adobe Launch. And I'm using Adobe Launch to populate Adobe Analytics. In the future, there may be a tag manager of Google Tag Manager, and you might in the future be able to use Adobe Launch to populate Adobe and Google Analytics, not just one. So I'm going to create a build. And now the next step I have to do is choose the environment that I want to build to. I can build to dev, staging, and prod. However, there's certain things that I can do in each environment. I can only build the tag manager to development, but I can build the data destination, which is the admin console, and the GitHub data layer docs in staging or prod or development. So to keep it simple, I'm going to do development. And I'm going to check off that I want to have Apollo create a new tag management instance for me. I'm going to have it build out all the variables in the admin console, which is the data destination, and push all the documentation into my data layer documentation tool, which is GitHub. Now, Apollo does have the ability to create a new launch instance or update an existing launch instance. In this case, I'm going to create a new one, but you could read our documentation on how to update your existing launch instance. Now, before I do this deployment, I want to kind of take a second and show you the before and after. So if I look at GitHub, you'll see that I have a main branch here, but nothing related to the implementation we've been building. If I look in Adobe Analytics, you'll see that I'm looking at the admin console and I'm looking at the EVAR area, and you'll see that I've deleted all of the EVARs here. And if I look at Adobe Launch, you'll see that I don't have any properties related to this property that I'm working on, Apollo, which is currently called the 99B2C Apollo demo. So everything is kind of starting from ground zero. So now I'm going to go ahead and deploy. Now, most deployments in a traditional world would take weeks or months to do. You've got to manually set up all of your documentation in a version control tool like GitHub. You've got to set up all your variables by hand in the admin console, and you've got to set up all of your rules, extensions, and data elements in a tag management system. But as you can see here, we are done in a matter of seconds. Apollo has shown that everything is successfully deployed. Now, if we want to see specifically what's deployed, we can use this little eye icon, and Apollo will show us all of the things that were just pushed. Some of them went to Adobe Launch, and at the bottom of the list, you'll see here that some of the things went to variable assignments, which were setting up all of the variables in the admin console. Anytime you do a build and you see a green plus next to it, that means it's something that was new to that build. So this means that you have a historical record that Adam Greco did a build on this date, and you can see what was in that build. Well, now let's look and see what happened. If we refresh our GitHub instance, you'll see that we now have a new branch called initial build, which is what I called it in Apollo. And if we open it up, we can see that we've got some general information, and this is the documentation that we saw. We can see that we've got data enriched events, which I talked about, the client side and server side, and we've got most of our information in our data layer events. So this is basically the same information that we had in Apollo. If we open it up, we can see here's the code that the developer is going to need and they can copy. We can see all of the documentation they need, including all the regex patterns. And since we added notes in this example, we can even see some of the notes that we added when we were in Apollo. So our developers have all of the information that they need in that branch. If we go into Adobe Analytics in the admin console and we refresh, we're going to see that all of the variables, the SPROPs, success events, and in this case, the EVARs that are needed for this implementation are all fully deployed. We have all the correct settings, and if we expand any of these, we can see here's an EVAR, user ID EVAR 40. We even know that it should expire never because that's a best practice. But if we look at, say, product brand, we can see that this is a merchandising EVAR. So Apollo has taken a stance based on our years of expertise of what the settings we think should be. And if we go into Adobe Launch and we refresh, we will see a new launch instance. That's the same name as our property with the date stamp of when it was done. And if we open this up, we will see that we've got our dev, staging, and prod environments. We've got all of the extensions that we need for this implementation. We have all of the data elements that are needed. And we have all of the rules. And you'll see that these rules are going to be exactly the same things that we see in GitHub, and they're going to be the same things that we saw in Apollo. And if we open up one of these rules, like say product added to cart, you'll see that we have a bunch of information going on here. We've got the event that's being fired, and this is managed by our data layer manager extension. We have consent management as a condition so that you can do consent management if you want. And we have all of the variables that need to be set. If we look at the AA set of variables, this is going to be the SC add, since this is product added to cart. And if we look at the products variable, you'll see that we've got the products variable being set. And in this case, we have two merchandising EVARs, brand and name. And we even have one custom success event, that's a currency event that's being set as part of the product string. So everything you need is here, and you didn't really have to lift a finger. Now, Apollo is specifying which things are managed by Apollo, and this phrase can be customized by you. I just set it to manage by Apollo, and you can add new things to here that aren't managed by Apollo as well. But anything that is managed by Apollo will be overwritten by future builds, but everything else should be good. You could add anything else, any other code that you want to it. So that's basically how we do a build. But the real power of Apollo is how fast you can add things to your implementation. So let's imagine that we now have everything working and it's the following week and someone comes to us and says, hey, we really need to add something new to our implementation. And what they want to do is they want to know when an order is placed, I want to know the SKU associated with orders, revenue, and units, but we're not doing that today. So we filter our requirements by orders, and I'm going to search for SKU. And sure enough, we have a bunch of requirements related to SKU, but this is the one they want, orders, revenue, and units by SKU, but it's not part of our implementation. Let's see how fast it is to add this to the implementation. I'm going to simply toggle this on. And you can see that a couple other requirements also got added because they use similar design elements. Next, I'm going to go to the assign custom variable screen and see if there's any new variables that need to be added. And it looks like there is one, product SKU, which needs to go in an EVAR. So I'm going to select this and I'll stick this in EVAR 7 and save. Now, if I go back to my documentation, if I don't trust Apollo, I can look here and see that under order placed, SKU has now been added. And if I look at the code, I can see that SKU is now here. I can also look at my visual SDR if I want, and I can see that if I scroll down here, I'll eventually see product SKU in EVAR 7. And right now that is only part of order placed. It doesn't have any other events, which later I probably want to clean that up, but I'm just going to keep it like that for now. And then I can come back to the deployment and do a new build. So I'm going to say this is build 2 with SKU. Now, obviously, normally you'd probably want to add a lot more if you're doing a build, but I'm going to just do this for demo purposes. And I'm going to deploy to the same development environment, and I'm going to update Tag Manager, the data destination, and the data layer docs, and go ahead and deploy. Now, what's happening now is Apollo is looking to see if there's anything new that needs to be added to the implementation since the last build. The data layer docs have been updated. It looks like the tag manager has been updated, and now the data destination has been updated. So if we go into GitHub and we refresh, we're now going to have a new build 2 with SKU. And if we look at build 2, if we look at the data layer events, now if we look at order placed, there's going to be a delta here. SKU is here and SKU is down here, which it wasn't there before. And you can use the built-in capabilities of GitHub to kind of look for differences, but that's basically the change that I know just happened. If I go into the admin console and I refresh, we should see a new merchandising EVAR that I believe was EVAR 7 for product SKU. And sure enough, here it is, and it's been updated and it's got all of the merchandising settings. And lastly, if we come to our tag management system, in this case, launch, and we open up our property, if I go into the rules and I go to order placed, let me just find order placed, here we go. Now, if I look at the products variable, I'm going to see that EVAR7 product SKU has been added to the order placed event. And obviously, there'll be a new data element here for SKU as well. So everything that we need is basically here, and we're good to go. So that's how fast you can add something to your implementation. And again, you could add one thing, you could add 20 things, whatever you need to. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is quality assurance. Once you start deploying things to an analytics implementation, you want to make sure that the quality is good. Apollo has two different ways to help you with data quality assurance. And one way is to check to make sure that the data is matching the data layer and the specifications that are in the data layer. So if we come to Adobe Launch, you'll notice that we have one of the extensions we include in Apollo is Data Layer Manager. Within Data Layer Manager, Apollo automatically sets all of the different elements. It has all of the events, all the ones that we configured in Apollo have been pushed here. And if we open up the JSON schema, we can see all the information that Apollo has communicated to Data Layer Manager. For example, it knows that there's a certain number of properties like product, price, selling price, product ID. It knows that name, product ID, and brand are required. If there's a regex pattern for, say, selling price, it knows that there's a regex pattern that has to be used. So all of this information is waiting here. And what that means is that when data goes through the tag management system, goes through Adobe Launch, and goes through Data Layer Manager, we can check things. So let's see an example of this. Here, I've got a fake website called Orbital Provisions, and I've got someone who's added something to the cart, and a developer has written some code here to check out, basically make sure that everything has been captured correctly for add to cart. So if I push this sample code, what Apollo is going to do is look through this code and see if everything is matching the data layer specifications that were expected. In this case, you could see that Apollo has surfaced two errors in the JavaScript console. One problem is that it's missing brand. You can see that it's got product ID, name, and SKU, but there's no brand, and that doesn't match the data layer specification. And again, the data layer specification can always be found in the documentation area. So if we look at product added to cart, clearly brand is supposed to be there. The second error has to do with a regex validation. It looks like selling price isn't right somehow. It's the $ $39.99. But if we look at the documentation, we can see that under selling price, it's not supposed to have a currency symbol, and it has examples of just numbers, and there's even a regex pattern to enforce that. But since this developer made a mistake, it flags that as an error, which is great because it means developers can solve things right away before they get moved on to other projects. Now, if they're not looking at the admin console, that's okay. Apollo also has an integration with a third-party product that's really inexpensive called Airbrake. And you'll notice that those same two errors have been pushed here. And so we can see whenever there's errors, and we could even use some more information like what was the URL they were on when the error took place. And Airbrake has also a feature where you can then push these errors to yourself via email if you want to do that as well. So that's a really cool way to make sure that all of the data is matching the data layer. And the more complete you make your data layer and the more you put regex patterns, the better your QA is going to be. Now, the other thing that people make mistakes on when it comes to digital analytics is not respecting the parameters and the settings or the conventions of their digital analytics tool. In this case, since we're using Adobe Analytics, there's a bunch of Adobe rules you have to follow. We have an extension here called Apollo QAX. And if you look at this launch extension, you will see that a lot of the common mistakes that people make in Adobe Analytics have been covered here, like having variables that are beyond the range of EVARs, events, or SPROPs, maybe doing things incorrectly with the naming of prop or EVAR, or too many characters in a variable, exceeding the byte limits, maybe not using the currency code when they need to, or the event string is set up with spaces or not with the right commas and so on, setting up the products variable correctly and so on. So there's about 50 checks here that are gone through. And what's great is anytime data is sent through the tag manager, we are checking all of these to validate that the beacon that you're sending to the analytics provider is correct. So let's see an example of this. Here, I've got a developer who's working on an order confirmation page, and they've made some code and they feel like everything is looking pretty good. So they're going to push this code. Now, if we look at the console, we'll see that everything matched the order placed from a data layer specifications. That all looks good. And then we started to check all of the different Adobe parameters. And then it looks like one error did pop up here, just one. And it's that the purchase ID is 22 bytes. And in Adobe Analytics, it has to be only 20 bytes. So that's something a developer might not know, but when they get this message, they can help fix that and make sure that the data is as clean as it can be. Once again, if you go into Airbrake, within a second or a minute or so, you'll see that that error has also been passed here, so you can have record of it for historical purposes, but now your developer can change it. So what's great is that between matching the data layer and the analytics beacon, we're covering probably 70 to 80% of the problems that most people have. Now, there are some cases where your developers really know very little about their analytics tool. And here's an example where I've got someone who really has no experience with Adobe Analytics. And if we push this code, I purposely put this code that has a lot of mistakes in it. But here you can see that Apollo is letting you know that there are tons of mistakes. Like, for example, there's no way that you have EBAR 301 because currently Adobe only lets you have 250. Here, the casing is wrong on EVAR and prop. Here, there's too many bytes in an SPROP. There's leading space errors in this and this. There's incorrect commas in the event string. Here, you've got a value that's not a number set in a success event, which doesn't work. Here, you've got a serialization error. And this is my favorite. Someone is trying to set EVAR 7, but Apollo knows that EVAR 7 is a product syntax merchandising EVAR, so you can't set it outside of the products variable. So this is great to know that Apollo has your back and will check for all of these issues. And as always, if you come back here, you'll see that all of these errors will start showing here, so you could address them as needed. So that's just a little bit about how Apollo helps you with QA. But there is another area that I want to mention, which has to do with tests. There are cases where you want to test the compliance on certain pages and make sure that certain values are being set. So Apollo has a way that you can set up manual tests. Now, I'll do an example here. This is not something you'll probably do all the time, but if you create a test, what Apollo is going to do is ask you which event it is that you want to test out. And it's going to show you all of the different events that you have in your implementation. In this case, I'm going to do a test of the product view. I'll just give it a sample test name. Then I'm going to put in a URL. Now, the URL that I'm going to use has to do with a Lego product. So I'm going to do Lego kit, which I just have a little shortcut for here. I can put a description here. And then the next step is I want to decide which attributes are the ones that I want to actually test. Well, I want to test brand and product name. So I'm going to add those. Now I get to tell Apollo what is the expectation on this particular URL. And I'm going to say for brand, it's Orbital Provisions. And the product name, and this happens to be a very long name here, so I have a little shortcut for this, and I'm going to just put in this long name, and I'm going to save. Now, what that's going to do is the next time I do a build, that is going to convey that to Data Layer Manager in the Apollo QAX extension and basically say, okay, I want you to check this particular URL for these values. And there's going to be a query string that is associated with this test. So if I go into my console here, what I'm going to do is kind of clear this, and I'm going to show you the URL that would be created. So I'm going to open up this URL, and you'll notice that this URL has a query string here. And this is what Apollo uses to test these particular values. Now, if you look at this code, I have purposely made some mistakes. Instead of it being the ASTP Lego kit, it's Lego Kite. And instead of it being orbital provisions for the brand, I've made it Frito-Lay. Now, when I run this code, what you'll see here is that all of the validation is going to go that we talked about earlier, but now it's added some new validation in the QAX extension, and you'll see that there's two errors. One is saying, hey, there's an unexpected value for EVAR5, which is brand, and there's also one wrong for EVAR6, which is name. And again, you could expand this. You can kind of get down to some of the error messages and kind of what was specifically looked for all under the parameters and so on. But if I want to show how this works when it's correct, I can simply clear this. And now here I have the correct code with orbital provisions, and I have Lego kit. And when I run this code, you can see that everything is passed. I've got no error messages. So this is an easy way that you can kind of see when you've got errors. And again, if you do have those errors like EVAR5, EVAR6 being wrong, all of these will be showing up here in AirBrake as well. So that's just a quick test of how you can kind of build test cases, and you can make as many of these as you want. Once you've created these test cases in the documentation area, as I mentioned earlier, you could download a spreadsheet that has all of your test cases, and it will show you all of the URLs and the expected values that you're supposed to have when you do the test, if you want to hand that off to a testing team. So once you're done testing and you feel like all of your data is good and you've already done your deployment, now let's talk about how you could start using your data. Well, before we use the data, we might want to do things like creating calculated metrics and dashboards. So if we come to the calculated metrics area, you will see that Apollo has a library of best practice calculated metrics that it's created. And this is based on our best practices over the years. Now, you first have to tell Apollo which environment you're working on, because you might have different things deployed in development, staging, and prod. In this demo, I only have stuff in development, so that's my only option. So I'm going to choose development. Now, when I do that, Apollo is going to change the screen and color code this with which elements I can do, which calculated metrics are available to me based on what I have deployed in my implementation. I have orders and cart additions, so I can turn on cart conversion rate. I have the elements needed for bounce rate, so I can turn that on as well. Now, if I wanted checkout conversion rate, I have orders, but I don't have checkout started. So I'd have to go back to the design area, add that event, add the requirements, and then do a deployment, and then I could turn that on. But I've got two calculated metrics that I can deploy. So I'm going to now push a button and create those calculated metrics. Apollo will then use its API capabilities to then push those two new calculated metrics into Adobe Analytics. So if we jump into Adobe Analytics and we go into the calculated metrics area, which is found underneath components, we should see two new calculated metrics. One was cart conversion rate, and the other is bounce rate. And we see which report suite and the data was created. When we open up cart conversion rate, you can see it's got a normal formula, and no one really ever know that this is created by Apollo versus created by a human. And you can make changes to these if you want once they're here, and you could share them with whoever you want to share them with. So that's an easy way to kind of push out some best practice calculated metrics. But another thing you're probably going to want to do is see a dashboard and start digging into the data. So once again, you choose the environment and then you push a button. And what Apollo is going to do is use all of the information it has about the implementation and build a first kind of draft of a couple analysis workspace dashboards for you in Adobe Analytics. And here you see it took about 30 seconds and our two dashboards have been created. So now we're going to go back into our components area and look at the different projects, and we'll see the two new dashboards. The first dashboard is called Learn About Your Implementation, and it's meant to kind of help your users understand what you've deployed. you can see that it's broken out by the different site features, and this aligns with the site features that were selected in the business requirements area. And if we expand here, we can see help text for all of the information that's in this dashboard. And this helps your users understand what variables you've deployed. And then you can see that Apollo has intelligently figured out what variables it thinks make sense. In this case, under the orders area, you probably want to see things like orders, revenue, units, and you want to probably see it by product brand, product name, product, SKU, and purchase ID. And if you want to look at maybe a longer time frame for this dashboard, you can always expand this just like you would in any other analysis workspace, and you can see more data here. Now, this is an easy way to just get started. Obviously, you'll want to do more with this and kind of add charts and graphs, but you could always right mouse click, copy the visualization, and then go put that into another dashboard. But this is a really easy kind of way to just start digging into the data. Now, another dashboard that we create, which is one that is really helpful, is called the Business Requirements Dashboard. Now, in Apollo, you can see here that if we go to the ACT area, after all the clicking we've been doing in this demo, we're up to 69 business requirements. So in order to answer those questions, we've made a dashboard that has one panel for every business question. So this means that this will have 69 business questions here. And so this makes it really easy for you to go back to your stakeholders and say, we have answered the questions that you asked us to answer. So for example, if I want to see which product brands had the most or least money added to the shopping cart, I could expand this and I would see a table that basically says, well, here's the product selling price with brand. In some of these cases, I don't have data because it's just a fake implementation. Let me see if I have any data if I expand this out. Here we go. So we're seeing that this is the table that is going to answer that question. If we want to look at something like which products by name had the most product detail views, we could expand that. And again, we'll see product name with product detail views. Again, not the world's greatest dashboard, but it's a good way to kind of get started and make sure that you're answering the questions that people want you to ask. So if we go back into Apollo, the last part I want to talk about is the ACT tab. So this is where you can see all of your requirements. If you forgot to earlier, you can put prioritization, you can put stakeholders, and so on. And there's some other cool things you can do here. If you want to filter your requirements, say, I just want to look at my requirements by the ones that are critical, you can filter that. For every business question, you can see which variables you're going to use in your analytics tool, which is really helpful. You can also filter by stakeholders. So if I just want to look at the Adam Greco ones, I can see that as well. And one of the really cool things that you can do is you can make a custom dashboard. So let's say I want to give a dashboard to Adam and he just wants to see the things that he cares about. Well, he can come here and check off these boxes and check off the requirements that you want, and then choose the environment, which will normally be production, but in this case it's development, and then push a button. Give it a name. I'll call this Adam's dashboard and deploy. And what we're doing is we're creating a custom dashboard just for these two requirements in Adobe Analytics. So this is really cool, and it's a great way to basically kind of get people engaged in your implementation. So if I go back to the products area here, here is Adam's dashboard. And if I open it up, it's going to have these two business questions. So that's a really helpful way to be able to get people the information that they need and kind of move on. And when you're done, you just kind of go back and you can see all of the requirements. If you do, for some reason, need to show all of the business questions that are in your implementation to a vendor or someone like that, you can use this button to always download into a spreadsheet all of your business requirements. Now, the last thing I'm going to show here is a more advanced feature. If your organization is in the Adobe world, and if you are going to move over to the Adobe Experience platform, that means that you have to convert your implementation into the Experience Data Model, otherwise known as XDM. And Apollo comes with a way that you can do that. Instead of it taking weeks or months, Apollo can do that in a matter of minutes. So if you decide that you want to convert over and start sending your data to the Adobe Edge instead of the old legacy version of Adobe Analytics and use AEP, you could at any time come into your property settings and you can choose this radio button to move your implementation into a modern implementation using XDM and hit save. Since this is not something you do all the time, Apollo is going to verify you want to do this. And just to warn you, if you click yes, all of the deployments associated with your old launch instance will be removed, and you will be starting over with a new launch instance that uses the Web SDK and XDM. So just be careful before you do this, but I'm going to hit yes, and I'm going to convert this over. Now, if I go back to the deployment area, you can see that all my deployments have been removed. And now I'm going to do a new build, and I'm going to call this my XDM build. Still using Adobe Launch to do Adobe Analytics and create. I'll choose my environment, and I can choose any of these, but these two aren't going to really change. So I'm going to just do Tag Manager and deploy. Now, what's happening here is Apollo is building out a new launch instance that uses the Web SDK. It's building all the data elements that use the XDM data elements. It's building all the extensions, and it's building a data stream that is required by AEP. And it's building out an AEP schema, which takes a ton of time. But as you can see, this was done in under a minute. So if we go into Launch, so let's go back into Adobe Launch. And now what you're going to see is we have a new launch property that was done about half hour later. And if we open up this launch property, it's going to look a little bit different. Some things will be similar. It's got the environments, it's got the extensions, but you'll notice now it's using the Web SDK, and a bunch of other extensions that weren't needed have been removed. Now it's got data elements here, but if we start scrolling through, you're going to start to see XDM data elements, which is new. And then we've got rules, and these rules are now set up to use XDM. So what's really cool about this is if we look at the data elements and we look at, say, let's look at, say, chat, we can see that now if we look at this XDM element, it has its home in the XDM schema. So here we can see where in the XDM schema chat started lives. So let's let this process for a second. And here we go. This happens to be under a custom element, and this says search discovery, but this would be your company name, whatever is your AEP company assigned name. And you can see that chat session ID and tracking the number of starts as a value, this is stuff that isn't part of the normal schema that comes out of the box with AEP. So this is a custom element. And what's great is if you want to actually see the entire schema set, what you can do is you can see the entire schema that Apollo built out by just coming to the schema area. And it's going to have the same name as your property. And you can see the full schema here. All of the custom stuff is going to be underneath your company name, which is search discovery. Here's the chat stuff we just saw. But we also have stuff that's unique to this implementation around users and video. Now, there's some things that are unique to our implementation, but they do align with other things that Adobe does out of the box. So in this case, you can see that SKU is something they do, but other things they're not doing, like product, brand, category, and name, are here. So we've kind of integrated with their schema to make sure that everything is in the logical place. But this entire schema was built in seconds, and you don't have to worry about it. The other thing that was created was a data stream, and this is a document that's needed to basically route things once you start sending data to the edge. In this case, the development one knows that this is the report suite where data should be sent to after it goes to the edge. So that's how you migrate your Apollo implementation over to XDM. But what's amazing is that your business requirements stay the same, your data layer stays the same. The only thing that's really changed is the stuff you're doing in launch. So that's a quick overview of how the Apollo product works. Hopefully you can see that it really does help streamline the implementation process and take a lot of the grunt work away from implementations. If, as you're trying out Apollo, you have any questions, we have a full help section here with tons of information about either the page you're on or just anything in general. You can search here. And we also have chat here. If you ever need some help, you can chat with one of our team members. So thank you so much for listening.